Verse 17 says this: He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. So the time frame for verse 17 is 47 BC. And it's dealing with pagan Rome and when it says he in this case, it's dealing with pagan Rome, but the person that we're dealing with is Julius Caesar. Everybody's heard of Julius Caesar, okay? So it says he comes into he enters the kingdom with his strength, and it says upright ones with him. Those upright ones are actually talking about Israel. Now in 47 BC, there's an internal warfare going on in Egypt, and Julius Caesar, or Rome, interposes in that fight. It's an actual struggle for supremacy between two conflicting parties in Rome, and he gets engaged in this war, and Israel actually helps during this warfare, during this fight. And just the last thing that we're just going to deal with in this verse, when it says the daughter, and he shall give him the daughter of women. Okay, most of us, I think people are already saying that, most of us realise that this is dealing with Cleopatra. Okay, it's dealing with Cleopatra, but this is the time frame that we're dealing with in verse 17. And this verse 17 is marking the first real interference of is dealing with the first real interference that pagan Rome has in the affairs of Egypt. So it's not a prophetic date that we're going to deal with, but it's the first stage, because things always happen in stages. Just like we had 197 and then it went into 168, which was a prophetic date. 47 is the first interference, but it's not a prophetic date.
What's the word next to daughter?
Daughter of women, sorry. Daughter of women. So I'm just quoting from the verse there, it says daughter of women.
Do you know why he's referred to as daughter?
I'm afraid I don't. There's a conflict between Cleopatra and her brother. They're both ruling, and they have civil wars breaking out, and Rome interferes in that to stop the civil war. There are two people reigning at the time. It's Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy the 13th. So into verse 13, sorry, verse 9, verse 18, I'm going to skip verse 18, there's not much information in there, so we're going to drop down to verse 19. We're going to skip verse 18. Into verse 19, Julius Caesar, I'll read the verse to us. Verse 19 says, Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall, and not be found. So the he is a continuation of the verses before it, and it's talking about Julius Caesar when he returns back to Rome and is finally killed. He's assassinated by the Senate, and that occurs in 44 BC. So it's dealing with the death of Julius Caesar.
Why Julius Caesar not Anthony?
Sorry?
Why Julius Caesar not Anthony?
Why not Anthony? The story of Anthony is dealt with in the second part of this history. In the second part, it's going to be... It's dealing with, in verse 25, yeah. And I think someone picked that up. It's in verse 25 that deals with Mark Antony. So we're in verse 20. In Rome. It says, he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, and he shall stumble and fall and not be found.
Did you cover verse 18?
I didn't cover verse 18, I'm skipping over verse 18 because we're running out of time. So we're into verse 20. Verse 20 is dealing with the birth of Christ. So we've come now into the time of the birth of Christ, and we're talking from 4 BC to 14 AD. 4 BC to 14, and it's around 4 BC.
Let's say that's 31 BC.
Sorry?
Let's say that's his home. I'll just see it.
Sorry, you have to speak a bit louder, I can't hear.
Could it not be the Augustus real?
Yes. Augustus is reigning in his time frame, so that's just a title that I'm giving it. This is during the reign of Augustus Caesar, and it picks up his history here in the first part of the verse. So verse 20 says, then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. Within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. Sorry, that was verse 20. Yeah, that was verse 20. I put circa because we're not exactly sure of the date of his birth. Okay, so that's why I've put that. It's around, Jesus was born around 4 BC, and we're going to go up to 14 AD. So it says, then shall stand up in his estate. So the his is Julius Caesar, and then it says stand up in his estate, or in his stead. And the person that we're dealing with now is Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus. We're in verse 20. Verse 20 is dealing with the birth of Christ, and it's during the reign of Caesar Augustus. And Caesar Augustus is known as a raiser of taxes. Okay? And this raising of the tax is mentioned, as I'm sure we all know, in Luke chapter 2 verse 1. In Luke chapter 2 verse 1 it says, and it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. So it actually names him in the scriptures as being the Caesar who undertook that work. And then the last part of the verse says, but within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. And he dies in 14 AD in peace. So it's dealing with the reign of Caesar Augustus, and you could put that as the kind of subject heading for verse 20, but I've put the birth of Christ because that's the focus, I think, where we should be looking at. It's dealing with the raiser of taxes. It's picking up this idea that we're in Luke 2:1.
You know when we look at the reign of Tiberius and nailing down on Christ?
Yes.
I'll start with that in 12 AD, because it's the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar.
Yes.
Christ was baptized. So when
Sorry.
Tiberius Caesar, within 4 BC to 14 AD.
Well, Tiberius Caesar's reign sorry, I gave you the wrong. Did I say Tiberius? Someone said Tiberius. Did you say that? Okay, we're talking about Caesar Augustus. Okay, Caesar Augustus' reign is 27 BC to 14 AD. That's when Caesar Augustus reigns. And that's within the time frame of the birth of Christ. And the raiser of taxes, the taxes raised at the birth of Christ. We know it's from Luke 2:1. So that's Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if I fully understand your question.
Where is Tiberius Caesar in the chapter?
Okay, so we're going to feature him in the next verse, in verse 21. So in verse 21, we're going to be dealing with Tiberius Caesar. So verse 21, dealing with Tiberius Caesar, and this is AD 14. It says, "And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give honour of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries." And that's talking about this vile person is Tiberius Caesar, and he begins his reign in AD 14. And if we go down to the next verse, because the next verse is connected with his reign, verse 22, it deals with the death or destruction of Tiberius Caesar. It says, "With arms of the flood shall they be overflown and shall be broken." So verses 22 and 22a is dealing with Tiberius Caesar. 21 and 22a, the first part of 22, goes from 14 to 37 AD. AD 14 to AD 37, it deals with the reign of Tiberius Caesar.
Didn't Tiberius Caesar start reigning at 12 AD? Was 15 years on top of that in his 15th year when Christ was baptized, his AD 27?
Let me try and address that afterwards. You may be right, but I'll have to go and double check my notes and my references. So the question is, the brother thinks that his reign is from 12 AD, not 14 AD, and he's using that based upon the 15th year when John the Baptist starts his ministry. Is that correct? Okay.
I can answer this question.
If you got it.
Tiberius Caesar
started ruling when he was with his co-father, his father in 12 AD.
Okay.
So he was the second brother, which he was when his father died when he was born.
Okay, so I think what he's saying is, and it happens quite often, that for the first 2 years of his reign he's a co-ruler, and then he rules solely by himself at 14.
We're talking about the dad here now, from 14 AD.
No, we're talking about Tiberius. So I guess what you'd get is this. You'd get his father does this, and he does this.
So he's ruling solely from AD 14.
Yeah.
Or ruling from AD 12.
So, does that answer the question? Okay. We're in verse 22b. This deals with the death of Christ. The second part of verse 22. So we're in AD 31, which again is within the reign of Tiberius Caesar. It says, "Yea, also the prince of the covenant." So when it says he shall be broken, it says also the prince of the covenant shall be broken as well. And that's dealing with the crucifixion. A good reference text to deal with that is when it talks about the prince of the covenant in this verse. If you go to Daniel chapter 8 verse 11, a similar term is used there where it says the prince of the host. So 11, 22 part B and Daniel 8:11 are dealing with the prince. It says here the prince of the covenant, and in there it says the prince of the host. So we've come all the way down to 22, and we started with the rising of of pagan Rome in the time frame of 168 BC and a little bit before that, and we've got all the way down to AD 70. We picked up AD 70 in actually verse 16, and then we backtracked slightly and went into some history. After that, we went back to 47 BC, 44, the birth of Christ, the reign of Tiberius Caesar, his death, and then the death of Christ. So can you see why I've given that the theme for the rising of pagan Rome and then the persecution of God's people? Yeah? So let's pick up from verse 23 now. Verse 23 says this. I was speaking to a brother earlier, and he believes, and I haven't seen the documentation, but